a joy to be able to read your book and find out things about you that I didn't know, and to hear your voice in a new form. And I thought that I would start by reading a couple sentences that are some of my favorites in the book. And I think it says a lot about you and how you approach food. There's a passage in which you describe your first session, which is a week of really focused Zen meditation. And at the time that you embarked on this, you were eating a lot of pastries, you were indulging your sweet tooth. And suddenly you were finding that your meals were consisting of plain rice and miso soup and pickled daikon. And yet you found it extraordinarily delicious. And here's what you said. It seemed to me that this goodness resided in my mouth and my attention as much as it resided in the food itself. It was my mouth that was the cook, my tongue the seasoning, and eating this way transcended food as usual. I just love that. And I'd like you to speak a little bit about the balance between, or the relationship between, the cerebral and the sensual in your approach to food.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because I don't think about the cerebral or the sensual particularly ever. But in that case, and I do remember that meal, and that was a very, very long time ago. It was so startling to me that such simple food could be so wonderful. And of course, there were a lot of qualities that made that possible. One was the sashimi itself, and that your legs hurt and you got to stretch and you were hungry and that's all there was, and you were eating in silence, and you suddenly could really taste everything so clearly. And I think I found from that meal that my entrance to Zen really was that meal, and it allowed me that kind of sensual, involvement is what allowed me to exist through the thick and thin places of life. So I don't know what else to say, but I don't have a very cerebral attitude towards food generally, I don't think.
I think what struck me was the way your experience of the food was having to do partly with the attention that you were paying to it. So it was that conscious part of your mind as opposed to just sort of the visceral.
Right, right. But that was a long time ago. That was then.
Oh, that was then, and now?
And now, not so much, I don't think.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I'm more interested in other things like who grew the food, where did it come from, those kinds of questions. Is it really good for me? Is it nourishing because it was cooked with kindness, or, things like that?
Talk a little bit more about that. I think another leitmotif in the book is the importance of people when you're eating food or when you're serving food. So even in the context of the Zen experience, where you're there in silence with your bowl, and it is very individual, at the same time, there are many people around you having somewhat the same experience. And when we talk about community now, I think it's particularly resonant during the pandemic, because so much of that has been taken from us. We're not allowed to gather in the way that we once did. So when you speak about food being prepared with kindness, or the role of people in the meal, I'd like to know more about that.
Well, that really is the theme of the book, I guess. Although when I read your question, I thought, it's funny you picked up on that, because I wasn't very aware of it. But in fact, that is the value of Sangha, of people doing something together. And it's the value of working in a restaurant with a team of people who are all subjected to the same kinds of stresses and pleasures and anxieties and fatigue as you are. And it's wonderful. But the theme of the book for me was really discovering what food mattered or what mattered about it. And it was about people. And the meals I remembered are meals that were prepared with care and kindness and thoughtfulness and graciousness. I love those meals, and they're really what I remember. And the attitude of the people was so much more important than whether or not there was meat on the plate. So,
would you say that now you prefer to cook by yourself, or do you like it to be a more communal experience? Do you like cooking with other people?
I do, but I don't get to do that very often, because I live in a tiny little community and I'm far away from a restaurant at all. And, so I do cook by myself. Although my husband has lately become interested in cooking with me, which is kind of interesting.
Does he follow your lead, or is he introducing you to?
No, he follows my lead. He's never even opened a cookbook before, so he loves the title of that book, Yes, Chef, and so he's always saying that to me. And I say, please don't, we're just cooking dinner. But anyway, I like having him in the kitchen and having him be interested.
Mm-hmm. Now that you've mentioned cookbooks, there was something else that you wrote about in the book, and that is how, as you were just beginning to cook for other people, you really relied a lot on cookbooks. You learned a tremendous amount from cookbooks. Mm-hmm. And my question now is sort of two-pronged. Are you still reading a lot of cookbooks? And if so, what are some of the ones that are lately inspiring you? And also, what do you look for in a cookbook?
Well, what I look for, I love good head notes, or like in your book, Fire and Ice, I love what you wrote before you get to the recipes, because it sets the context for another culture, the place of food in that culture, if it is another culture, or our own for that matter. So I love good head notes. I think they're really important. And they're kind of a map of where you're going to go too. And that's important to know. I wish I could learn that lesson better than I do, because sometimes even when I'm cooking my own recipes, I don't read it through. And then I find out that, oh, I was supposed to do this and I didn't do it. And it takes hours or whatever. But I don't use so many cookbooks now. I do use my own. I have to cook something. And it's actually kind of a pleasure to cook for my own cookbooks, because we never get to do that as cookbook authors, because you're on to the next. So yeah. I'm doing that. And I can now go back to what were classics for me and are classics for me, which are probably too old-fashioned for anybody else. But I love my Paul Wolfert recipes, Jane Grigson, the people who inspired me a long time ago, Richard Olney, I maybe use their cookbooks. And a more recent author is Ottolenghi, because that's kind of my heritage. I grew up in a Mediterranean climate, and I understand those recipes and the flavors and what he brings together.
I still love those old cookbooks too. There's something very comforting about the food, and there's something very lovely about the way the recipes are articulated. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you feel this too, but with each subsequent cookbook, it seems that the demand on the author to make everything absolutely precise down to the last eighth of a teaspoon is expected by a lot of readers now, or certainly publishers. And I like the more discursive manner of the old cookbooks that leave some room for imagination.
I like that too. And it fits my way of writing too, much better, I think.
Yeah. You said that you don't really enjoy the challenge of cooking so much any longer. Uh, in your early days, would you say that cooking for you was somewhat more aspirational in that you were trying to achieve a certain level of skill or a certain um, taste that you were aiming towards, whereas now it's just getting a beautiful meal on the table and not caring so much about perfection?
Well, I've never really, I think perfection is a little bit overrated, anyway. But it is true that in the beginning, I was just discovering food, like a lot of us were. And I have all these notebooks filled with ideas and lists of things to try. And it just seems so wonderful and so unusual. And now they seem, it's the jaded palate syndrome, I think. You know, what I said in the book was I didn't care about cooking things so much as I know I said I didn't care about change for the sake of change. Like I wasn't going to become a vegan because veganism was popular, for example. So, I do cook with care, and it's hard. I mean, it's just hard to do it every single day. I think that a lot of us are beginning to feel that, and I know I have it easier than a lot of people. I only cook really dinner or breakfast. Lunch, we're on our own. I don't have kids. I don't have kids at home, so that makes a big difference. But it's hard nonetheless.
So what does a typical day look like for you these days?
Well, right now it's all over the map because of the book, and Zoom things like today. But when we first went into lockdown in March, I spent a lot of time in my garden, weeding out all the salsify that I planted for vegetable literacy, which
Oh, I wish you could send some to me. I love it, and it's so hard to find.
Oh, but it's so easy to grow, and it will take over and just, impregnate your garden with weeds. But so I've worked a lot in my garden. Now winter has started. It snowed last night. So there's no more snow on the ground, but it's chilly. It's a little bit too cold to be out there. So I'm writing. I am writing. I'm thinking about what I want to do next. And I think it's going to be about 72 labors. It's going to be about the foods that have come to us and why they got here and how they got here. And, so I've been working on some of those essays.
Tell the audience a little bit more about 72 labors.
Yes, those were the first words of the meal chant, the Buddhist meal chant, when I first started as a Zen student. It was 72 labors brought us this rice. We should know how it comes to us. And I was very taken by the idea of 72. Was it really just 72? Was it not 73 or 100 or 25 or, and later, I don't know what 72 really means, but it caught me, it caught me up in that kind of question of what does it mean? What are the steps? So I started thinking about somebody who planted a garden, and then that things had to be washed and the water had to be hauled probably and originally for the washing, and all these steps had to take place for the simplest ingredient, and be it salt, or basil or zucchini or whatever. There were a lot of steps involved. So I've been very intrigued by that idea for a long, long time.
That'll be a very interesting book of essays.
I hope so.
Another thing that struck me that you said was that you're too much of a purist for today's tastes. And I wonder how you conceive of the contemporary palate, and what about it you find less than tasteful.
Well, I was thinking especially of hummus, which drives me crazy because you go to the store. First of all, you should make it at home because it should be warm and fresh and delicious. But you go to the store and there's so many kinds of hummus, and there's green chili and red chili and sriracha and this and that. And I think to myself, does anybody know that the Arabic word for chickpea is hummus, and it's just chickpeas and tahini maybe and a little garlic or not, and olive oil and the water that you cook the chickpeas in, and it drives me crazy when we feel we have to go so far in an exotic direction. When the original is perfectly good and it has meaning in the word. Hummus is chickpeas.
Mhm. Do you have that beautiful book that came out last year called Hummus?
I don't have it. I
Oh,
kind of stopped buying cookbooks. I really,
okay.
didn't do it I haven't done it for a while.
Do you think that's a particularly American approach to food? Do you think it
Oh,
says
yeah.
something about our larger society?
I think it does probably. I mean, look at how we've turned foods around. Yogurt, which
Oh,
was, I remember having my first taste of yogurt, and it was such a frightening thing to taste, food that had such an old history. Um, and I was told it was sour milk, and nowadays we have so many yogurts. We have aisles full of yogurt, but they do in France too, in supermarkets there, because I've been to them. And we have aisles full of yogurt, and they're often flavored in unsavory ways, with corn, I don't know, corn syrup, you know, just all kinds of junk.
additives.
Yeah,
Yeah.
additives, really. And and the form that you can slurp it, you can suck it out of the tube. I
Oh,
think
yes, that's an abomination.
I mean, I just don't want to eat that way ever. Also, with tofu, we've done the same thing. I mean, we have tofurkeys, we have this, we have that, we have tofu that's supposed to be Thai marinated, and tofu that's supposed to be Italian seasonings on it. And I just don't really get it, what that's about, because tofu is an exquisite thing when you have it right. It really, really is. But none of us know that anymore. Nobody
Well,
knows.
I should be grateful because that kind of tofu has not reached our local store.
Oh,
So I've never experienced that, but I'll beware.
well, it does exist, let me tell you. And it has for a while. And
Uh,
even the American style tofu, which is, extra firm, so I don't know why, you can put it on a grill or something. That's not the most delicious kind of tofu, but sometimes that's all there is. You know, Asian tofu is much more delicate, it's lovely, it's soft, it's tender, it's silken, it's strained through silk, it's not through cotton.
One of the important things about your book is that it's really as much about the awakening of the American palate and the development of a lively food culture here as it is about your own trajectory. And you were in California, in the Bay Area, one could say at the right time, but you also contributed a lot to the growth of this awareness. And I'm curious what you see as your particular place in it and what you feel is your greatest contribution.
Well, this is something I know I never think about, so it's a little bit hard to answer. But I, I think maybe what I was most passionate about were the new vegetables that we were growing at our farm, and that we were able to introduce them to people. And now they're very commonplace. You can go to Trader Joe's, you can buy arugula three times washed in a bag, and golden beets and things like that. But I have to remind people that there was a time when those foods didn't exist here. They didn't. And there were a number of chefs who were responsible for bringing them into being, into our consciousness. And I think I was one of them. And probably making vegetarian food more acceptable was better, a good thing to do.
So that leads me to my next provocative question. It's fair to say that people think of you as a vegetable queen of sorts, and you have made your reputation through vegetables largely. And yet you write that you really resist being pigeonholed as someone who does vegetarian food. You don't want that label. Vegetables you'll embrace, but you don't want to be seen as solely focused on a vegetarian diet. And I wonder if you could talk some more about that.
Oh yeah, I could talk a lot about that.
Oh, do, please.
First of all, I feel that, especially at the time, that to say you were a vegetarian was more about pushing food away than bringing food towards you. And personally, I never wanted anyone to jump through hoops on my behalf, thinking I was a vegetarian, that they needed to get way, way out of their comfort zone if they were meat eaters. And I think, at the time, that was probably a reasonable thing for people of my generation to request, that you just cook what you're going to cook. I can manage. I eat everything, whatever. Today with Meatless Mondays it's different. I think more people are used to it. I find it limiting mostly, like I was always asked by magazines to write about grains and beans, even though I'd been a pastry chef and a regular chef and cooked a lot of different foods that I wanted to write about, that I was interested in. And actually today, grains and beans, I mean, they've exploded on our consciousness so much, and they're wonderful. But I haven't written an article for a long, long time about them. I also felt it was important to know what the culture at large is doing, what they're experiencing. And if they're eating meat, as Americans do, we eat a lot of meat, we should know something about it. And I tell a story in that chapter on my vegetarian problem that you may remember, about I put on Facebook that about a meal that this group I was a member of, the Southwest Grass-Fed Livestock Alliance, I was actually a board member, a wonderful beer bar in Albuquerque was putting on a dinner. And it was going to showcase local grass-fed beef in such a way that little bits of beef, were going to suffice for a whole meal. And so I posted it on Facebook because I thought it was a great opportunity for people to come and learn. And somebody said, "Oh, it's a dead cow." And I said, "Well, yeah, but that isn't a useful response because of that dead cow. It meant a lot of wildlife was now thriving on this land. Water had been brought back to it with great difficulty and expense, but it fed lots of animals, not just that cow. And there were a number of other reasons too why it mattered. And yet I felt that this kind of rejection was so hard, and I kept encountering that. I have encountered it many times. And of course, interviewers usually want to ask you about protein, if you get enough protein as a vegetarian. I'm just not that interested in that question. I could go on. I left all my notes. I got your wonderful questions and I left them at home. I was in such a hurry to get here when I got that email.
Oh, I don't think you need the notes. That's a good enough answer, and it's a good answer.
Thank you.
Maybe you could talk about sugar and your early life as a pastry chef, which I think most people don't know about.
Oh, well, I worked at Chez Panisse with Lindsay Shear and learning pastry from her. And she was really my mentor and such a wonderful and exquisite cook. Um, and then when I did it again at Cafe Escalera in Santa Fe, partly because I really wanted the quiet of the pastry kitchen. I didn't want to be on the line and all that frenzy, although, of course, in the beginning we did both. But I did learn to make cheese, and I did notice when you do things with sugar, clouds of it come up, it coats your throat. I didn't like it so much in the end, making regular pastry. So now it's really a rare occasion when we have a dessert, and it's nice.
When you cook, do you tend to use get into things with your hands?
Oh yeah.
Do you like to work with savory doughs?
Mm-hmm. Sure, I do, and I think our hands are our best tools. You know, they tell us so much. There's so much information that they can parse. You know, just through touch and you know, is it gritty? Is it smooth? Is it together? Does it need to be more? Does it need to be? If it's less, well, then you're in trouble because you can't take it away. But yes, I do. I love using my hands, and without gloves too.
Yeah, I love that tactile
Yeah.
experience in the kitchen.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's fair to say, if you have a mantra, if it's okay to use that word, in a very secular context, it would be eating local and eating seasonally, which I think many of us absolutely take for granted now. But when you started out, it was quite difficult.
Yes.
Because there were not a lot of means of distribution. And there were still very few farmers markets. And that's one of the things that you write about in the book, how that early movement to get more local produce to people developed. And maybe you can talk about your work with farmers markets a bit.
Sure. I mean, in California, we had everything, even if we didn't have farmers markets. We had one farmers market originally in when I started Greens, or before then, I think. When I moved to Flagstaff, there was nothing at all. So I thought I have to live near agriculture. And so I moved over here to New Mexico because I knew there was a farmer's market in Santa Fe, which is about 20 miles away from here. And so the first day I arrived, I hadn't even unpacked. I went to the market because it was a Saturday to get some food. And I overheard somebody say, "Oh, I could really use some help running the market." And I thought, you know, that's why I moved here. I should help. So I offered to help. And it was such a wonderful experience because I really got stitched into the life of northern New Mexico in a way that I wouldn't have if I hadn't done that. So it was a very, you know, regular kind of job, except it was all volunteer. And I noticed that about farmers markets across the country, that there were these little events that popped up, and you know, they moved around. Sometimes ours moved around till we had a permanent home, and they were all run by volunteers, and there you could get the best food, and the food that was probably most iconic of the area in which it was grown. So I liked that. To me, it was very important.
So in New Mexico, of course, I'm on the other side of the country, in the Northeast, but when I think of New Mexico, I think of hatch chilies.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yes, they like you to think of hatch chilies,
okay.
But we have another chili here. We have a landrace chili that we call our chili in the north, and it's a little bit more twisted, and I think it's delicious. And Hatch is a very tiny place, and it's just chili fields, you know, galore around there. But up here where it's hard to grow things, our little landrace chilies are wonderful.
Oh, I'll have to come taste them.
You will.
But obviously, New Mexico's advertising campaigns have been successful.
They have.
But are there other foods that you think of as iconic, other sorts of produce?
From here?
Yeah, that we might not be aware
All
of.
the corn products are quite wonderful. Chicos, for example, which are dried corn. They look like little teeth when you buy them, and they're very expensive, but you throw a handful into a pot of beans and they're wonderful. They increase their size, they're sweet, they're delicious. They really taste like corn. And we have a lot of farmers now grinding their own corn to make cornmeal, which is great. Anyway, all the corn things I think are very iconic to this area. But there are lots of things, as with the chili too. But there are a lot of things that we don't see so much. We're not so interested in, I'm afraid. Like the melons from Santo Domingo Pueblo that used to be at the farmer's market. They're not quite sweet. They're not quite a cucumber. They're kind of in between, and nobody would buy them. So they gave up, bringing them to the market, I think. But originally when I came to New Mexico, our farmer's market was so tiny and there was nothing in it except a few very indifferent carrots and tomatoes. And then there was choke cherry jelly, which is something special. Pozole, which is something special from this area. It's a dried corn that's treated in lime first. And Riesters are red chili. So I brought them all back to Greens and tried to cook with them.
You say that your own taste runs to the Mediterranean, partly because you grew up in Davis in a somewhat Mediterranean climate. Are there other cuisines that you're particularly drawn to?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I've thought about that because they're all Mediterranean, whether it's Italian or Middle Eastern or, they're all from around that area. But I am drawn to Japanese food, partly because I've been to Japan and I spent a summer there and I really love the lightness of that food. And I take classes in that cooking sometimes. And it's quite wonderful to see one chicken thigh can feed 4 people, for example. It's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I'm not a purist, my husband asked me the other day, he said, how about corn dogs? I said, I've never had a corn dog. What do you mean? And he said, well, could you make them? And I said, I don't know. What are they? So he told me what they were. And then I went onto YouTube and I found how to make them and I made them. They were actually good. We used Nyman Ranch, Frankfurters, but they're kind
and
of
local corn, no doubt, that was very flavorful.
Yeah,
Local cornmeal.
actually, it was very good. It looked a lot like a chili relleno.
Right. I actually love corn dogs. So we want to leave some time for questions. So I'll just ask you one last question from myself. And that is, how do you see I hate this word, but I'm going to use it, the future foodscape in America?
Well, that's a good question. And I see it going in opposite directions very fast, and I'm worried a little bit about is going all in the same, turning on the good side of local foods, heritage foods, and so forth, that it's rushing back, to join up with the bad foods or the not so good foods, because it's like corn dogs. I mean, people are tired of shopping. You can't shop. It's dangerous to go out. You get things online and suddenly these old fashioned foods seem pretty good. And, so what if you're using this kind of potato and not that kind, something from the store, doesn't matter. So I don't know. I get an email every day from Food Dive, which is about it's the commercial side of food. And it's horrifying to me to see what it's about and where it's going. And, it's all about mergers and, money and this kind of thing. And it's very different from the kinds of farmers that most of us deal with on a weekly or biweekly basis. So I kind of feel that people are interested in the good food, and the good kinds of agriculture that are happening, regenerative agriculture and so forth. At the same time, there are a lot of people who are interested in the money side of food and the not so wholesome side. So I think it's going both ways at the same time.
Well, we can only hope that there will be a Secretary of Agriculture who will be supportive of all farmers. I'm very hopeful about that.
Good.
Yeah. So Deborah, thank you so much. I hope there are questions from the audience. Amanda is going to moderate them.
Yes, thank you. That was a wonderful talk. I feel like I learned a lot about Deborah and just also about the food world at large.